Hi, welcome. I am Dr. John Jackson, filling in for my good friend Alan Freedom, who is on a reconnaissance mission deep in the wilds of South Dakota looking for Bigfoot. Tonight, we are joined by Reverend Eric Redmond to discuss some of the recent movements we see in Congress and at the White House. How are you doing, Eric?
Appreciate it. Thank you so much. Happy to be here.
Yeah, we are happy to have you. It's great to meet you and have you here. We are from Capitol Hill. It is an online government sim game. You can play with us at TedderVision.com and join the fun. It is amazing. So today we want to kind of talk about this New York Times op-ed piece that just came out. Eric?
Yeah, absolutely.
What do you make of the New York Times editorial board making this pretty big claim that the Congressional Budget Office should be looking at this?
Yeah, I mean, to me, this is pretty standard stuff. I quibble sometimes with the CBO. I feel like in some situations, namely Obamacare, the CBO was just wildly off base. But that being said, even though it's been off base in the past, it does present a sort of baseline view of how a piece of legislation might impact the United States. And even though it's wrong, sometimes it at least gives us a starting point. And in my opinion, everything needs to run by it. So I don't understand both strategically or tactically why you wouldn't want to do that.
Wow, we are in agreement there. The CBO did review Obamacare, Affordable Care Act, for those who like official names, and they were, I think, a bit more accurate than I think the Obama administration likes to let on. But I agree. It's really interesting that House Republicans would try to slip this bill through so quickly. Do you think perhaps they're trying to take advantage of the majority they have currently and the goodwill they've been building up with their America First agenda?
I can't say that specifically. I mean, it looks like that on the outside, but at the same time, some of these measures that were passed were measures that, frankly, have been long in coming, and I can understand when let's speak specifically about the visa overstay and the Mobilizing Against Sanctuary Cities Act. I think one could argue reasonably that these are measures that should have been passed many, many years ago, if not decades ago. And in that scenario, when national security is on the line, I could understand maybe wanting to rush it through. I personally think, again, as I mentioned before, both strategically and tactically it was a mistake, but I at least understand the logic behind it. I don't necessarily think that it's because they're afraid to have the CBO look at it, although I can't rule that out.
Interesting. So you think that perhaps because they've done, as you say, a good job with some of these other bills, that they're just kind of on a roll, not necessarily that they're afraid of what the CBO might say?
Yeah, I mean, to be honest with you, I just don't know that the CBO would make the kind of definitive statement that would turn public tide against any of this. I mean, most of these bills relative to our federal budget are not going to be particularly expensive. I'll leave out the Made in America Act because I think maybe that bill, one could argue that there'd be enough of a financial impact that the CBO's determination might in some way change public opinion. But I think the other two bills, which are kind of the basis of what we're discussing, I just don't see the CBO doing anything that would turn the American people against them, because the bills we're talking about are mostly philosophical in nature. What people are going to care about, why they're going to like this bill or why they're not going to like this bill, has much more to do with where they fall philosophically than the fact that a couple decimal points are going to be pushed around. So again, that's why strategically I think it was a mistake to not have them look at it because I think it would have been irrelevant and it would have given Republicans, or I guess it would have given Democrats, far fewer attack lines.
Understandable. So you think almost that it's just a poor strategic choice more than anything else. What would you say to the argument that because this is a tax reform bill, that perhaps the CBO is most appropriate to judge this as opposed to any other kinds of bills they might be looking at?
Well, if we're talking about, so I was speaking specifically about the first three bills, but if we're talking about the tax reform bill, yeah, I think in that one, I think strategically, I think it was a mistake because I think people understand that a tax bill that has tax cuts, the CBO historically grades them very poorly because they don't tend to take a dynamic grading position. Like, in other words, they don't account for growth in that. And I think most people understand that. Most people that care about a CBO grade understand that. And so it's an easy attack point for Republicans, folks on my side of the aisle, to refute. And tactically, I think it was foolish, again, because I think it just opened them up to attacks that they were pretty needless. The CBO historically for tax plans have pretty grossly undervalued the amount that growth will impact the economy. So they tend to undershoot that, which Democrats almost always use to make hay. And whether it's the Reagan tax cuts, whether it's the Bush tax cuts, our economy tends to do much better than the CBO ultimately grades out. And for that reason alone, I think it gives conservatives, Republicans, a pretty strong defense against any arguments. And it's not the worst decision that they could have made, I guess, but I think it was unnecessary. I would have said just let them do it, let them grade it.
Yeah, and I agree. The CBO can be overly cautious in their evaluations. I think there's a bit of a doomsday fetish amongst them to this is the absolute worst that could happen.
Right.
Sometimes
right.
Chicken Little is a good thing to call them. But
Right.
Earlier you made the point about the more the philosophical guidance behind these America First bills, such as
Right.
the Overstay Act,
Right.
The mobilization against sanctuary cities, the merit-based immigration, the Made in America Act, and the Fair Currency Exchange Act are all kind of considered part of this nationalist type movement you see in the House of Representatives and Congress. What do you kind of make of it from an eagle-eyed view?
Well, I want to start by saying, as a constitutional conservative, I don't really believe in this whole nationalist populist movement. I mean, I think it says something that Trump, on one hand, to his credit, but also to a conservative, I think it's probably to his detriment, got a lot of Bernie supporters. The populist movement historically has had some pretty dangerous outcomes. It tends to dovetail very nicely into progressivism. So, I'm not necessarily as bullish on national populism. That said, I look at each bill by bill, and if it's a good bill, then it's a good bill. And I don't really, the fact that it's labeled populist or it's labeled this or that, there are times when populism dovetails pretty nicely with the conservative cause. So, the Visa Overstay Enforcement Act is one of those acts. I mean, when you're talking about constitutional conservatism, you're talking about the rule of law. And when you're talking about the rule of law, you're talking about the fact that a lot of these immigrants that come here that overstay their visas, and most of the time, let's be honest, it's knowingly. They knowingly break the law. These are folks that come here, they use the visa as a gateway to get into our country, and then they overstay their visa on purpose. They blend into society. We never see them again. Sometimes they're great. They're great. They're people that work. They're people that contribute to society, and sometimes they're not. But in any event, they're breaking the law. So this is the kind of thing that dovetails pretty nicely into what a constitutional conservative would be happy with. And long story short, I think bills like that are great. The Made in America Act, I'm a lot more bearish on. I'm a lot less thrilled with it.
And why is that? Because President Fitzgerald seems to be fairly excited about that bill.
Yeah, so I guess I'll speak for myself, I guess, but I think generally your constitutional conservative would take a pretty laissez-faire approach to our economy. So the more government intervention, the less we tend to be happy with it. And yeah, this doesn't seem like it does a lot, right? So it just establishes labels that can be used as a voluntary means of indicating to consumers what products are of U.S. origin. But to the degree that artificially monkeys with any prices or that changes people's buying habits, that's not a place for government. That to me, that's government overreach, stepping in and trying to take what is a free market, and we can argue just how free it is, but it takes a free market and it tries to guide it in a particular direction. I get why the president signed it. I get that he sees the economy as a means to producing jobs, but your typical libertarian or constitutional conservative doesn't. The economy in and of itself is like a means to its own ends, and it being unleashed creates jobs on its own. So, is it the worst bill in the world? No. I mean, it's not something I think to go to the mat for, but I'm not particularly thrilled with bills like this or where they lead, because I think this opens up a Democrat or a progressive to do something far more nefarious using the exact same logic the president has used here.
So it sounds like to me that perhaps when it comes to issues like immigration, foreign relationships, and security, you seem pretty in favor of strong governmental intervention. But for domestic policies, not so much. Am I reading that correctly?
I think that's exactly right. And to me, that's exactly what the Constitution draws us towards. There are things the states cannot do themselves, namely defense, national defense. And in those situations, it's totally appropriate for the government to step in, provide those services, provide that support. In areas that don't require government intervention, we shouldn't be intervening. Now, we're a long way from that, okay? Starting with the progressive era, we've moved way, way beyond that. But it's never too late to turn back. And while I really love probably 80% of what President Fitzgerald is doing, this little bit of populism, this little bit of nationalism is not what the doctor ordered if you're a constitutional conservative.
And I think your phrase, never too late to turn back, sums up that stance quite strongly, quite accurately. So then I guess the next question I would have is, wouldn't you say that these kind of bills are kind of the natural progression from a lot of that same rhetoric you're using? Because, I mean, it's not 1783 anymore. So wouldn't this just be kind of a natural progression from a lot of the things we were seeing back when the Constitution was first being drafted?
Well, I mean, I guess what I would say is it's progression if you mean the continued encroachment of the federal government in our lives and in our economy. It's not progression in terms of progress. I mean, that implies that any move forward is progress. Well, that's not necessarily so. There's a million things that societies have done over the spans of many societies where they've wandered too far. They've gone way too far, and it's had to be dialed back. There are movements that no longer exist because they fell out of relevance, because what they did wasn't working. So progress, there's this idea that progress always is of net benefit, and at this point, I think we've wandered way too far off the reservation in terms of our constitutional mandates, and we do need to get back to it.
So would that mean bills like defunding Planned Parenthood and the Keystone Pipeline and the Restricting Abortions Acts, will you say that those are overreach?
Well, I guess let's take them one by one. Why don't you tell me about or at least tell me the name of the first one, and we'll go from there.
Yes. So the three that I mentioned, the Defund Planned Parenthood Act, was put forward by the Republican Congress to pretty much remove all federal funding from Planned Parenthood clinics from across the country. And for those who don't know, Planned Parenthood is one of the leading healthcare providers for low-income women in rural and urban areas.
Yeah, exactly. And so what you have here with Planned Parenthood, and by the way, Planned Parenthood's not alone in this. It's just one of the more egregious organizations due to its prolific desire to kill children. But leaving that aside, the issue here is that the government should not be in the business of funding what should be private organizations. And I maintain some consistency here. I don't believe in crony capitalism when it comes to oil companies. I don't believe in crony capitalism when it comes to abortion mills. These organizations should be able to stand on their own in the free market and not take the funding from the American people. I mean, to me, that is rolling back to a place where our government does not belong and should not be operating in. So that is one example of where I think going backwards is actually going forwards in terms of like human progress and progress for this country.
Then let me ask you this question in response to that. Mm-hmm. Oftentimes when we see the government stepping in, like providing funding for nonprofits that target low-income persons, it's because otherwise there's no drive for a business or an organization to work with low-income people because you don't really make money doing that. So I guess my question is, what gives you confidence that the market will direct the healthcare providers to provide access to vital medicines and procedures that otherwise these people will not be able to afford?
Well, I mean, for many, many years, decades, generations, we've had hospitals that have provided pro bono work. We've had charities that have provided, I can't even tens of millions of dollars towards people getting the services that they need. The question isn't really should there be a safety net in this world. Okay, I think Americans are a generous people. I think Americans are a kind people. I think the question isn't whether or not there should be a safety net. The question is whether or not the government, and I'm speaking specifically right now about the federal government, because I think states are laboratories of democracy and can do what they want with their dollars as they see fit. So I want it to be clear that I'm speaking specifically about the federal government, whether it's the federal government that should be providing these subsidies, these bailouts, these handouts to folks. There was American healthcare before the government took over the industry. There was charity for the poor before all of this happened. The question is, why did this happen, and what do we do now? My side says roll all of that back. There's nothing in the Constitution that says we should be doing it. If you feel like we should be doing it, have the guts to amend the Constitution, but don't do all this through the back door, which is exactly what we're doing, which is exactly why I have a real problem with our government funding a bunch of things, from Planned Parenthood to oil companies to, you name it. So, poor people survived before 1913 when the progressives took over America.
Poor people did not die at first. but they did and continue to die at much higher rates, both at birth and childbirth from preventable diseases, than people who aren't low income. And so a lot of these bills and laws and support that came up was in response to the fact that, hey, citizens are dying. Citizens are being taken advantage of and abused by their employers or by their landlords. So the government needs to step in and make sure that every person in this country has the same opportunity to thrive as anyone else. And that's kind of the basis for a lot of these laws, which is why I think people who wanted to start rolling them back without kind of providing a replacement to make sure that those same protections exist are really skeptical and afraid and maybe even angry at that kind of notion. Does that make sense to you?
It makes sense to me, but that really isn't the question, Dr. Jackson. I mean, the question here is not whether or not there should be a safety net. The question is whether or not someone has a right to a safety net. Well, I'm sorry, but that right isn't in the Constitution. Now, again, if you want to talk state by state, and if a state wants to do that, if someone like California wants to raise state taxes to some astronomical rate so that they can create millions and millions of housing units for people so that there's no poor people on the streets, you're not going to find too many problems with that from a constitutional conservative as it relates to what the federal government's role is. The question is, do they have a right to federal support to make that happen? And it's just not there in the Constitution. It just isn't there. So, I'm trying not to like quibble too much in semantics, but there is a state versus federal responsibility that does play a role in this. And to the degree that you mentioned, well, there were people that were in worse shape and now our poor are in better shape because of the federal government. I don't know about that. I mean, take a look at from the time of Lyndon Johnson's War on Poverty. What's that really changed? There's just as many folks in poverty as there were back then, and we've spent trillions and trillions of dollars in this so-called war on poverty. So the question is, number one, is there even a right to do it? And number two, how effective is it really? And I don't see the data that it's been particularly effective. Again, on a federal level, I just can't be more clear about that. I'm talking about on a federal level.
Yes. This is a show that focuses on federal issues, so for sure.
Right. And so just to tie that, by the way.
Yeah.
Well, just to tie that back to the president's agenda, to the degree that his populism pushes him to involve the federal government where it doesn't belong, then those of us on the conservative side stand against that. And to the degree that he rightly places federal support, federal dollars, and federal power where it does belong, such as the Visa Overstay Act and the Mobilizing Against Sanctuary City Act, we're going to support him.
As much as I would love to get into a constitutional discussion with you, and point out these areas where we have very strong disagreements. Mm-hmm. I do want to ask you about the Thin Blue Line Act that makes attacking police officers and other first responders a federal crime. That had wide bipartisan support on both sides, where both Republicans and Democrats came together to say, yes, we need to make sure that we're protecting our police officers and firefighters and EMTs across the nation. But we also had a lot of pushback from both sides about whether or not this is not even just a federal issue, but even a state issue, as police departments tend to be controlled locally. So what are some of your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I got to say, in terms of leadership on both sides of the aisle, I think it was politically smart for them to back this bill. I think philosophically they were wrong to do it. So, I get why this looks really good on a pamphlet or in an election day, television ad. I get that. It sounds good. It sort of sounds good rolling off your tongue. It sounds good when you hear it. Of course, we want to protect these people. But it just goes to show you how far progressivism has moved us, where we just sort of default to, well, of course the federal government should be looking into this. Of course they should be protecting people. We don't even stop to think about the fact that it's really not under their purview. And you bring up a good point. There were some very, I think, astute and I don't know, philosophically consistent individuals that said, wait a minute. Once we start doing this, where does it end? And as much as I absolutely stand with our first responders and with our police, I do think there are times where you have to grit your teeth and say this isn't a federal issue, and unfortunately this is one of those times.
And on that note, I want to thank you, Reverend Eric Redmond, for coming in. We like to give folks a final opportunity to call it parting shots to kind of say their piece in the last kind of minute we have on the show. So this is your chance to give one final parting shot.
Well, I just think in with this particular government, where you have a pretty heavy moderate Democrat liberal side, you've got a populist wing. I think it's time for conservatives to call balls and strikes. There's no need to be part of the rah-rah cheerleader group for the president when he overreaches and has a populism streak, takes government to supporting progressive ideas. At the same time, when the president does something that is truly within our belief system, that is truly great, something like the visa overstay, I think we need to stand up, step up, defend him, and support the party, and kind of brace for the next election when he's going to need all the help that he can get.
Well, thank you, Reverend. That I love your passion with which you spoke, and I think your ideas probably resonated with many of our listeners tonight. So thank you so much. And for those of you who are joining us, this is Capitol Hill. We are a government sim game on TedderVision.com. Come check us out. We are free to play, and we would love to have you join us. We hope to see you soon.